Introducing Ghost Hunt the game, Ghost Hunt the book, and Ghost Hunt the movie. Hello, my name is Kevin. I'm here to tell you why Ghost Hunt needs your help. To fully understand the Ghost Hunt concept, we have to go back to the very beginning. I was born at an early age in a small island nation in the North Atlantic called England. Here I am with my parents. Here's me with my sisters. Every Christmas we used to get a different board game. I loved playing them all, but especially the ones that had a theme.
Like the pirate game. Your playing piece is an old Spanish galleon. The board is an ocean full of islands. You sail around digging up treasure and having sea battles. Or the detective game, you know, the one you have to solve the murder. Miss Strawberry, in the laundry room, with the lawnmower. Or the money game, the tycoon game. Your playing piece is a bucket or a toilet plunger. You move around the board buying up property, charging rent, making everyone destitute and bankrupt. As I grew older, I started playing more complex role-playing games. Knights and wizards in underground worlds. It would take 5,000 dice, and sometimes the game would take weeks or even months to play. When it was time, fortified by my mother's words of encouragement, I left home. For a few years I travelled the world, thousands of miles in all directions. But eventually, I ended up landing in California, where back in 1992 I thought to myself, I want to make a board game of my very own. I like all things spooky, like graveyards, ghosts, monsters, witches, creatures of the night. And I want to combine this into a game, and I'm going to call it Ghost Hunt. I would take all the components and features of all my favourite board games and incorporate them into Ghost Hunt, like a really giant playing board, so big it'd have to be on canvas and rolled up. It would be the grounds of Greyfriar Hall. There would be the ground floor of the haunted mansion itself. There'd be a graveyard, and even a weird house on the lake, and a ruined abbey, and a petrified forest, and even a haunted bandstand. And that's for playing pieces. I don't want a boring wooden one, or a toilet plunger, or a bucket, or a sewing machine. So I thought to myself, what kind of characters would you find in a haunted mansion? It was obvious. There'd be a Victorian policeman called Sergeant Oates, a gorgeous hitchhiker called Svetlana from Sweden, a reporter from 1940s Brooklyn called Natalie, an extremely handsome ghost hunter from Oxford called Nick, a dowdy psychic called Ruth, and of course, there would be a mad scientist. So here's the layout of Greyfriar Hall. Game would commence with all the playing pieces being put on the gatehouse, and the game clock being put to midnight. Players would take it in turns to move around the board. When everybody had taken a turn, the game clock would be moved on to 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or 20 minutes, depending on how long of a game you'd want. Everywhere you landed, you'd pick up a location card. You'd either find an object like a Bible in the library, or a hammer and wooden stakes, or a gun with silver bullets, or a crossbow, or a magical sword, or a flaming torch. Or you could encounter a creature like a monster in the ruins, or an undead thing in the lake, or a goblin in the library, or a werewolf in the forest, or a skeleton in the graveyard, or a devil on the pathway, or a witch in one of the towers, and of course there was ghosts everywhere. An example of a move would be you went to one of the towers, you picked up a playing card, it told you found a hidden door that led to a secret passage to a vampire's lair. A dice roll would tell you whether it was awake. If you had some garlic, you defend yourself and score some points. A silver cross, you score even more. If you had both, you score even more. But if you had a dagger or a club, you'd probably lose points. If, however, he was asleep in his coffin, you had some wooden stakes and a mallet, you could kill him and score a load of points. Or in the forest, you could encounter a werewolf. If you have a gun with silver bullets, you could defend yourself. If you didn't, you'd probably be on the menu and lose some points. But there are also good witches and bad witches and witches that were asleep. Or in the graveyard, you could encounter a devil, but just as easily just meet some guy that was lost. Some locations are more dangerous than others, like the graveyard, or the ruined abbey, or the weird house on the lake. The rooms of the mansion are pretty safe, except for the 2 towers. But when the game clock reaches 5 and the sun rises, the player with the most points wins. I was ready to launch Ghost Hunt into the world. I had my prototype. I acquired GhostHunt.com. And I put together a rudimentary website. And then I checked my pockets. I found a bit of loose change and a dollar bill and some fluff. But I realized that wasn't enough to get the game manufactured. I was going crazy. What was I going to do? I wanted people to know about Ghost Hunt. So I stood on my head and I thought, I'll write a book about it. Meet Katie, the main character from my story. She's good looking, she's got it all going on, and she likes all things spooky, and she plays Ghost Hunt. Well, one night, while playing the game with some friends, an evil force kidnaps her and deposits her in an altered reality within the game itself. At first, she didn't realize where she was. She was standing outside a pair of gates, which in the game would look like this, but in her reality, they were like this. And then these characters started showing up, and then she realized where she was. Except they weren't playing pieces anymore. They were bizarre, real people, which she had to deal with. And the other problem was, the creatures of the night were no longer on playing cards. They were very real, or very dead, depending on which way you looked at it. In the game, they were kind of fuzzy and cute and kind of looked like this, and only points were at stake. But where she was, the creatures looked more like this, and this. These creatures could actually do her harm. In the game, being chased by a mummy through the graveyard meant that only points were at stake. In her new terrifying reality, she was running for her life. Trapped in a land of werewolves, witches, and undead creatures, Katie had to become more daring and resourceful than she had ever been before. Winning a real-life game of Ghost Hunt in this strange world of haunted mansions, graveyards, and ghosts might be her only way home. I checked my pockets, but I only found more pocket fluff. I couldn't afford the top-rate editing that I wanted, but it was published anyway, and it's available at these fine stores. Despite its subprime condition, a movie guy from this place, who had already won a couple of these things, noticed it and he called me. And he said, "Kevin, I love your Ghost Hunt idea and I want to make a movie about it." He took it to a major studio and had a meeting. I couldn't be more excited. I was bouncing off the walls. Terms like screenplay, pre-production, development were used. I'm not sure quite what happened, but it all ended up a bit like this and turned into a bit of a... I was devastated, but I knew there was something really special about Ghost Hunt, and if one movie guy liked it, there was bound to be another. So I got up, brushed myself off, and thought about what I wanted to do next. I wanted to go back and re-edit and rewrite Ghost Hunt at the beginning, but instead move forward. I made GhostHunt.com better with more content, and I started writing my next book, Ghost Hunt, The Circle of 10, The Further Crazy Adventures of Katie. It's a gothic tale of castles, windswept landscapes, mysterious stone circles, Knights Templars, and lost treasure. The story begins one day when Katie receives a phone call from her cousin Sally. You can tell them apart because Sally has the blonde hair and Katie has the red hair. Sally tells Katie about a competition the makers of Ghost Hunt were having for people to write in with a new theme for a game. For inspiration, Sally thought they should visit a castle she knew about. The problem was it was in the middle of nowhere. So she suggested they rent mountain bikes and make an adventure of it. The evening before their journey, they checked into an old inn on the edge of the windswept moor. That night, Katie received a spectral visitation warning her about going on the journey and giving the first few lines of a riddle. Despite receiving this warning, Katie and Sally set off across the moor anyway. After discovering a mysterious circle of singing stones and exploring an abbey full of the spirits of its long-dead inhabitants, they arrive at an ancient Templar castle. After doing some exploring, they visit a nearby maze, where the same dark, malevolent force that captured Katie before grabs both of them and throws them back 300 years into the past. They did not realize it yet, but they were now in the year 1709. When they eventually made their way out of the maze, they were confronted by a madman on a horse. His name was Daniel, and thinking that Katie and Sally were trespassers, poachers, or possibly witches, he took them prisoner and dragged them back to the now inhabited castle, where amongst others, they met Daniel's much nicer twin brother Thomas. Despite the harsh reality of living in a castle in the 18th century, with its cold, dark, damp rooms, primitive facilities, rats and bad food, Katie knew that simply escaping the castle was not enough. They would still be in the year 1709. To find their way home back through time, they are forced to solve a 700-year-old mystery by deciphering an ancient riddle. Along the way, they stumble into lost Templar treasure and find themselves tangled up in gothic curses, ghostly encounters, witches, and did I mention bad food? Well, that's a quick glimpse at Ghost Hunt Circle of 10. It's almost finished, and like my first book, it needs a good professional editing. So you see most of the history of Ghost Hunt. As I mentioned earlier about Ghost Hunt needing your help, on or by Halloween 2013, I will have a project up on Kickstarter.com where you can get involved with the further development of Ghost Hunt. In the meantime, you can go to GhostHunt.com for stories and character bios. And there's a contact page, so if you have a comment, suggestion, or idea, you can send me an email. And of course, if you have anything to do with movies, Katie and I would simply love to hear from you. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and as always, happy hunting.